Do you go by Gabriel or by Gabe, or what do you go by?
I go by Gabriel.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Gabriel Andrade. I'm broadcasting from Dubai. And joining me today on the other end of the line is Dr. Richard Weikart. He's a professor of history at California State University. So he's joining us from California, and today we'll be speaking about the history of communism and the family. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I would like to begin with Marx and Engels, because I suppose those are the two most important intellectual figures. A lot of people talk about Lenin and so on, but really, I mean, the ones who really got it started, at least for the modern world, they were Marx and Engels, and you wrote a very good article on this. So what do Marx and Engels think about the family?
Yeah, Marx and Engels didn't write extensively. Well, Marx himself didn't write extensively about the family, but he makes a lot of comments here and there sprinkled throughout his works, like the German ideology that he wrote in the mid-1840s, in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, and then Capital. He doesn't really talk much about the family. Engels actually spent a little bit more time discussing the family. He actually wrote an entire book the year after Marx died in 1884 called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. So we have actually a lot more of what Engels said about it than Marx. But still, Marx does indicate in his writings that he does think that somehow the family is going to be ultimately eliminated in a future communist society. He sees the family as being ultimately founded upon the economic structures of society, private property, which he saw as really the key instigator of all ills in society. And so he saw the family sort of being tightly connected to the origins of private property. And so once you get rid of private property, Marx thought that a lot of different social institutions were going to dissolve, including the state. He thought that the state would simply disappear, but also the family seems to be on his radar too, as ultimately going by the board once you get rid of capitalist society.
So what will replace it?
Well, that's a great question. And Marx didn't actually like to talk a lot about the details of communist society. In fact, Engels referred to earlier socialists, such as Robert Owen in England, Charles Fourier in France, as what he called utopian socialists, because he thought that they had sort of tried to sketch out these utopian plans for some particular societies, and they were all different. Different socialists had different ways of planning these things out. Marx didn't like to sort of give very much detailed blueprint about what his future communist society was going to look like. He thought that the natural laws of social development would sort of take care of that, and once you got rid of private property, everything would sort of handle itself, so to speak. So they didn't really get into a lot of detail. They do indicate, however, Engels, again, more than Marx, that there probably would be some situation of what I call in my article a romantic dyad, a romantic pairing of a male and female for perhaps long periods of time. But this would be completely free and voluntary. A person could come into that relationship or leave that relationship at will. It would not be a lifelong monogamous commitment. Maybe perhaps what we have in our society today, where you have easy divorce, getting married, easy divorce, and go get married someone else, kind of situation like that. But they would not even have had probably would not have been comfortable even with the legally recognized marriage. It would just be completely voluntary. The government would have no recognition of it whatsoever, it seems.
But it seems to me that what you're describing in this communist ideation of what's to come in Marx's version, even though, let's say, the rules would be relaxed because there would be easy divorce and so on, and maybe other people can come into relationships and so on, it seems to me that they still value pair bonding. I mean, it's not like they are advocating for promiscuity where, everybody has sex with everybody and so on, and there's no permanent bonds. I mean, it seems to me that they do accept the possibility that one man and one woman can stay together for, long periods of time, and they can have a special relationship. Yeah, am I right? Or?
Yeah,
I think we lost your audio there. Go ahead. No, we still lost your audio. Are you muted? Oh, there you are.
No, I'm not muted. My
There you are.
internet.
Okay, no
Yeah, my
problem.
internet
Yeah,
sometimes
so
messes.
take it back from the beginning, please.
Yeah, it does seem that this notion of a pairing is sort of what they were considering sort of more natural, and it sort of mirrors their own sexual relationships. Although Friedrich Engels, as a young man, had a number of flings very early on, later on he did settle into a more stable relationship with a woman, which lasted until her death. And then he formed a relationship with her sister, which lasted until her death. And Marx did get married and remained married, although he did have an extramarital affair at one point and had a child out of wedlock. But for the most part, they did remain fairly committed to one sexual partner at a time. So they do see this as more a pairing situation. Now, that's, by the way, in contrast to another socialist thinker, Charles Fourier in France, who thought that there should be complete sexual liberation, and he believed that these socialist communes that he wanted to establish, that he called phalansteries, that these phalansteries would have orgies going on and all sorts of just free sexual relationships that were short-lived, and basically going from one sexual partner to the other. Marx and Engels didn't embrace that kind of sexual libertinism.
So apparently in the 19th century, there was some fear mongering going on amongst anti-communists into saying that, oh, look, if the communists come, they will nationalize women and they will force women to have sex with everybody because, a group of men should have sex with a group of women. And Marx was always saying, don't be afraid, we will never do that. Were they right to play this fear-mongering game? In the sense that were the anti-communists fair in their critiques of Marx and Engels into saying that if communism ever comes to place, it will be mayhem because, they will take us to live almost like animals?
Well, certainly in Marx and Engels' views, that was not correct. If you're looking at Fourier, it did seem more like that. If you're looking at, but even there in Fourier's situation, it was completely, they were supposed to be voluntary relationships. And so Marx and Engels likewise saw these as voluntary relationships. They critiqued one of their critiques of the capitalist system was that capitalism allowed people to force women into sexual bondage, such as prostitution, or women working for capitalists, being forced to have sex with them, or other kinds of things like that. So that was actually one of their critiques of capitalist systems. So they were wanting completely voluntary kind of sexual relations.
Right, which I suppose is different from other utopian schemes, because you're saying that as wild as it may have been, Fourier's utopia didn't force anybody to have sex with another person in particular. But it appears to me that in the history of utopias, there have been some particular examples in which women would be forced to have sex with other men in the name of public property. And to a certain extent, like Plato in the Republic, he talks a little bit about this. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that, and how does that compare to Fourier and Marx and so on, the scheme, the utopian scheme in Plato regarding the community of women and so on.
Yeah, well, again, that's not going to be the way that most of the socialists in the 19th century, including certainly Marx and Engels, were going to be framing things. Again, they were wanting complete voluntary relationship. In fact, one of the most important ideals for Marx in the Communist Manifesto and his other writings as well was liberty, liberation, freedom. And Marx believed that getting rid of private property was going to increase freedom for the individual. Now, the irony, of course, is that every time that regimes have tried to introduce Marxist ideas into practice, which has happened numerous occasions in the 20th century, they've always ended up with less liberty, not more. Interestingly, by the way, different regimes such as in the Soviet Union, the communist regime, there actually was some attempt to try to dismantle the family structure, but it really ran into lots of opposition socially from the very start and never really got off the ground. So they never really were able to implement any of their moves to try to to abolish the family completely. They did loosen divorce laws. They did try to make divorce easier in the Soviet Union. Of course, much of the Western countries have followed them in that respect in the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century. But they never really were able to dismantle the family they wanted to. But of course, they did introduce societies that are known for their lack of liberties rather than liberation.
Right. Wasn't there a Soviet woman who say that having sex should be as easy as drinking water or something like that, and that it should come naturally? So, you know, just as you would not deny a glass of water to a person, you should, if you feel like having sex with someone, you should just feel liberated and go for it. I remember, I think her name was Alexandra something, Alexandra Kollontai.
Probably Kollontai, I'm guessing. I don't know that exact quote. Alexandra Kollontai was one of the key Soviet women thinkers in the early 20th century, who was one of the higher ups in the Soviet Communist Party. Interestingly, though, there were very few women, despite the fact that the Soviets claimed to be standing for freedom for women and greater rights for women and equality. There were very few women involved in the Soviet government. Kollontai was actually an exception to that. And the same thing was true in other places. In Germany, in the Communist Party, there were a few people like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. So there were a few women that were involved in leadership positions, and it was possible, but it was pretty much dominated by men still at that point.
Right. I think the great irony here, at least for feminists, is that all these things that are done in the name of liberation ultimately come back to haunt women. Because if you have a society where having sex requires no commitment, but you let yourself go and fulfill your desires and so on, that plays to the advantage of men. I mean, what man wouldn't like to have 5, 10 women all at once and then just walk off and not take care of pregnancy, right? So ultimately, it does come to harm women. And I suppose that's what may have happened in the Soviet case. I mean, in the name of liberation, they loosen all these things. But I suppose that there had to be a great number of unwanted pregnancies, or at least abandoned pregnant women, because if it was so easy to get a divorce and walk off, then why should men care about, about taking care of pregnancies at all, right?
Yeah. And in fact, there was a very poignant example in Marx's own family that I discuss in my article about Marx, Engels, and the abolition of the family. And that is Marx's daughter, Eleanor, who developed, this was after Marx was dead, but she developed a relationship with a man named Edward Aveling. And Edward Aveling ultimately two-timed her. In fact, he actually married someone while he was still living with Eleanor Marx. And ultimately, it devastated Eleanor Marx to the extent that she committed suicide. And so, it sounds wonderful, oh, everyone's having, voluntary relationships, but, there's a sense in which, well, people get hurt in sexual relationships if one party decides, I want out, I want to go somewhere else, I'm going to, have 2 or 3, or as you're suggesting, or whatever, they're wanting to do. It's not like, oh, that everyone, is benefited by that. The other partner, the aggrieved partner, gets harmed. And in Eleanor Marx's case, she committed suicide over it.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that communists want us not to be jealous, to share things, including romantic partners or sexual partners, but they don't come to terms with the fact that jealousy, it seems to be too strong, embedded in our human nature. So I suppose part of this utopian thinking is to think that we can overcome human nature and be done with jealousy, but I don't think we can ever get there. I mean, what's your take on the status of jealousy and human nature? Can we ever overcome it?
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, I really love Alexander Solzhenitsyn's writings, and in his book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, I think he really hits on this very theme of the fact that the Soviets are trying to transform human nature. In fact, that's what their labor camps were about. Their labor camps were an attempt to try to transform human nature. And they thought that if they just got rid of, and Marx, going back to Marx in the 19th century, Marx and Engels believed that if you just got rid of private property, human nature would be radically transformed. So they would have said, this jealousy, envy, other things like that, once we get rid of private property, we won't have to deal with that. Human nature will change. It'll be radically transformed. I personally think that's one of the biggest problems with communism and socialism. I think the biggest problem is not their desire to, equalize things, economically and things like that. The biggest problem is that they don't understand human nature, that human nature does have fixed desires and such that are not just going to be transformed when you transform the economic situation.
Right, indeed. Now, I would have to say, in defense of Marx and Engels and other communists, that if your ultimate goal is to abolish private property, then I suppose the family must be part of that package of abolition, because the family structure ultimately does protect private property. I mean, if you have your own child, you will give your own child more things than any other child in the street. And there have been some contemporary philosophers who I don't think it would be fair to call them communists, but they are concerned that the family may be an unfair institution. I'm thinking, for instance, of John Rawls, right, the famous philosopher of justice. He does say, well, I mean, family is a bit unfair because you don't get to choose what family you're born in. You don't get to choose how much money you're going to inherit from your parents. You don't get to choose how much your parents will read to you during bedtime and so on, right? So, I mean, you come to this world and there are good families and there are bad families. And that from the onset it seems like a very unfair state of affairs. So if you want to equalize things, as I suppose that's the ultimate goal of communism, as you very well mentioned, then inevitably you do have to do away with the family. So I do see some inner consistency in their claim. What's your take on that?
Sure, I'd agree with that completely. I think it is consistent with their vision of private property and society and such. And in fact, even more than that, Robert Owen, the early 19th century socialist thinker, before Marx, who himself was very opposed to the family structure. In fact, he claimed that there were three main evils in society. One was private property. The second was the institution of marriage and the family. And the third one was religion. Owen pointed out, and I think too, that the family is a conservative institution, that the parents would train their children in the ways of the past, the traditions that they've learned. And so he saw it as being not only unfair in the sense of, giving certain people advantages and other people less advantages, but also it perpetuated the ideas of the past. And so he wanted universal education for children starting as young as possible to try to get them out of the influence of their parents. And by the way, I think we see this going on in our society to some degree today with some of the public education, where there are educators, and I've talked to some, who do see themselves as trying to wean their children away from the ideas of their parents, trying to get them away from what they see as the they would say probably reactionary ideas that their parents are putting forward. But yeah, I think you're right that there is a consistency in their view of the family in the sense of their entire worldview. Of course, I don't embrace their worldview, so I see problems with the family. But in thinking about the family, thinking about the unfairness issue which you raise, which is very real in their worldview, there's the sense in which I think that communists and socialists don't understand the human need for love. In fact, it's not just the communists and socialists. There actually were some behaviorist psychologists in the early 20th century in the United States who were saying similar kinds of things. Let's just get the kids away from their parents. We can figure out the ways to raise these kids. They don't take seriously the fact that we need to have relationships with people that are closer than certain other people. And the family is a place where that love can thrive. And yes, there are bad families, but let's teach the fathers and mothers to be good parents instead of,
right.
bad parents.
Right. I mean, in psychology, there's attachment theory, right? Which is what you're talking about. I mean, the need for attachment. I think you're talking about those psychologists who propose to take away children from their parents and raise them differently. Right. I suppose Skinner was one of them, right? On all the behaviorists. Right. But the theories of attachment theory they say, no, it doesn't work like that. You need to hug someone. You need to have, you know, the fairy, at least in the case, there were some famous experiments with little monkeys, and they hung on to fairy puppets, right? Because the warmth gave them, you know, um, psychological comfort and so on. So yeah, this is a big issue. I wonder, in Marx and Engels' ideas of the future, and you've already established that they don't say much, but what do they say about children? If the family is to be abolished, and we have these occasional pairings based on, you know, voluntary associations and so on, how are children supposed to be raised?
They did make pretty clear, especially Engels in his book on the origins of the family, private property, and the state, that they thought they should be communally raised as early as possible. Engels makes a comment about as soon as they can leave their mother, you know, as soon as they can be weaned from their mother's breast, essentially, they thought they should be raised communally. And in fact, Engels actually argued that this would make it even easier for women to get involved in sexual relationships with men, because they didn't have to worry about the children, because the children would be essentially, at a very young age, they'd be alleviated of that responsibility, so they wouldn't have to worry about the responsibility of bringing children into the world. I find that a very interesting idea, because I think that would have, of course, led to a lot more pregnancies and a lot more children being brought into the world if you have a system like that where, oh, I don't have to worry about my child, you know, taken care of by someone else. But I think it also, again, ignores, though, the human nature, because there's a lot, you know, today, women actually do have the option, if they get pregnant, of giving up their child for adoption. It's actually very simple. You don't have to take responsibility for your child if you don't want to. You can give birth to your child, and you can give it up for adoption. Or, in fact, in the United States, we actually have places where you can take your children, take your babies, and drop them off, like fire stations. For example, I live in a town that has a fire station. At the fire station, you can drop off your child, and they will take your child, and they will place it in a foster home where the child can be taken care of. But actually, that doesn't happen very much. Women who bring their child to birth typically want to keep it. They don't want to just give it up for adoption. Okay, there are some that do. Of course, that happens, but it's actually not that frequent. Most women have this maternal desire, and again, this is part of their human nature that I think Marx and Engels didn't factor in. They want that child. They want to experience that child. They want to interact with that child. They want to love that child.
Do you think Marx and Engels would accuse those women who hung on to their children as selfish? I mean, would that have been a word that they would have been used against those women? Selfishness.
That's possible, although I think that, again, Marx and Engels have this, in my view, wrong conception that ultimately, once you get rid of private property and such, I think they just don't think it's going to be an issue. I think they think that women are just going to hand over their children. It's not going to be a big deal. I think that's naive. But again, I think that's how they see things.
Right. And what does this communal raising of children entail? I mean, because, okay, we're mentioning it on paper, but when we get to the details, what is it like? I mean, is it like a huge room with thousands of beds and a huge dining room where they take breakfast every morning all together? How would it work?
Well, they didn't spell it out in detail. I don't think it'd be quite as barrack-like as you're describing. Probably houses with you know, maybe a couple dozen kids or something like that. I don't know how exactly. Maybe like a large orphanage. I don't know exactly. Again, they didn't go into a lot of detail about this. In fact, not only did they think that children should be communally raised, they also thought that women's housework and cooking and such should also be done communally in various ways. But they didn't spell out exactly how it's going to happen. I mean, I suppose that would be maids going around town, you know, doing, you know, making up all the beds and, you know, vacuuming all the houses and stuff like that, I guess. But they didn't go into a lot of detail about how that was actually practically going to work out. I think they thought that the planners in the future, you know, could take care of that.
A lot is made about the kibbutz movement in Israel, because a lot of, I don't know if a lot of communists, but some communists will point out to that experience as successful. And yes, there is no promiscuity there. I mean, it's not like there is group marriage or anything like that. marriage is still an institution, but children are indeed raised communally. And apparently, contrary to many expectations, it has worked. I mean, these children have not been especially pathological or anything like that. I mean, they have been quite functional. So would that be a refutation of some of the things you said, that, you know, we have this human need and so on of attachment? Because if children in the kibbutz in Israel do turn out to be okay, apparently, wouldn't that be proof that this is in fact possible?
Well, it might be possible in small contexts of people that are committed to that, going into developing that institution. And there also are some religious groups that have formed various communal kinds of land ownership and child raising and such, and education and such, that we could point to, I suppose, too. But these are pretty small minorities, so I really am skeptical that that would happen on a large scale, and that it would be possible. So again, yeah, if you have people that are radically committed to those ideals, and they, you know, form, as in the kibbutz movement, and I must say I'm not terribly familiar with the details. I mean, I know roughly about them, but I don't know a lot of the details of what's gone on with that. But I think this is a pretty small movement in relation to all of society.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I should say that it's not as successful as sometimes it's claimed, because there have been long-term studies that turn out to prove that children do want to be with their parents, right? Because I mean, as you say, it's asking too much of some parents to say, oh, forget about your children. From now on, everyone in the village will be your children. No, that's not the way we want it. I mean, that a lot of people make a lot about that African saying that, oh, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, no, I mean, I think it takes a family to raise a child. Sure, the village can help, but ultimately, I want to separate my own children from the rest of children in the village, right?
Sure, you know, in terms of it takes a village, yes, other adults, and it's very helpful when there are other people that are around you who are confirming what you're telling your children and such. Obviously, when you're living in a society, if the society is telling them totally different things than what you're telling, which in my case does happen quite frequently. I'm fairly conservative religiously and such, and so my children don't get a lot of times from the media and from the outside community confirmed in what I teach them, and so then it can lead into confusion, and they may decide to go the way of the rest of the world rather than the way that I'm trying to teach them. And yeah, that's reality. So yeah, I think it's great when the community outside is helping and confirming what you're doing and trying to keep your kids straight and such. But if there's conflict between what you as a family are teaching your children, what society's teaching, then yeah, that can be a little different. So.
Right. I'd like to get back to Engels, the origin of the family, the state, and private property, because you talked about it, and you also mentioned it in your article. Now, that book is not so much about what lies ahead in the future of communism, but actually what was going on in the past. And as you explain in the article, and anybody can read the article and Engels' book itself, it appears that Engels was saying that prior to civilization, human nature was to be promiscuous and not to have specific monogamous pair bondings. How do those theories work? What did Engels have in mind about the remote past of humanity?
Yeah, there were some anthropologists in the middle of the 19th century that claimed, and Engels was going to borrow this idea from them, that
we lost you there again. So yeah, maybe there might be some bad connection, but I'm sure it will come back. So I ask our listeners just to be patient. No, you're still silent, but I'm sure it will come back.
Hear you just fine.
There you go. Okay, please take it back. Get your answer from the beginning, please.
Yeah, Engels, in his book, The Origins of the Family, was borrowing ideas from some anthropologists in the 19th century who believed that the earliest form of sexual partnerships in the so-called primitive societies, so they were thinking like hunter-gatherer societies, were basically completely promiscuous, that people could have sexual relationships with any males with any female, females with any male. That was completely voluntary, completely promiscuous. This was an idea that was floated a good deal at that time, based in part upon misunderstandings of anthropologists from societies that they really didn't have a lot of in-depth contact with. It's the same problem that we ended up with in the 20th century also, with some anthropologists who, like Margaret Mead, who wrote these glowing things about the Samoans and their sexual relationships and such, but she really didn't understand what was going on in that society. And so as time has gone on, these ideas have basically been exploded by anthropologists themselves as they've gotten more in-depth knowledge of some of these hunter-gatherer societies. And no, the relationships within those hunter-gatherer societies that are still around, or were at least around in the 20th century, weren't just promiscuous, anyone having sexual relations with anyone else. But that's what Engels thought was the case before the introduction of private property. But then he thought the introduction of private property was a key feature that was going to alter the family relationships and bring about situations of women's subjection to men, which, by the way, he actually calls one of the first episodes in Private Property. He claimed the women were considered private property in these ancient societies, but then ultimately developing through to monogamy. So one of the things that he did is he thought that there was this historical development taking place in the family, just like he thought there was a historical development taking place within the economic relations and other things. And so he didn't see the monogamous family as having any kind of absolute validity. It simply was one historical stage that later is going to be superseded.
But did he think about this remote, promiscuous past as a sort of golden age to which we shall return once communism is achieved?
No, I think he actually thought that that stages that had developed since then had, I don't know if advanced is the right word, but had changed in such a way that the final stage later on is going to be completely different. So I don't think he sees or wants to go back to a return to that. I mean, Fourier does seem to be more like a return to that kind of thing. But no, I don't think Marx and Engels were wanting a return to that. They thought that they were going to reach ever higher levels. Marx and Engels, of course, were heavily influenced by Hegel, the 19th century German philosopher, who believed that there were historical stages that were ever reaching higher and higher levels. And Marx and Engels seem to think that too, that there's these historical stages happening, and within the family, that's going to be leading to higher and higher levels. And so I think they don't see a return to the primitive. They see that as being, totally gone and sort of on the lower levels, but they're moving up to ever higher levels.
Yeah, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, please. But in my interpretation, or the way I see it, is that if this higher level, when we get to communism and so on, is a state where there is not properly promiscuity, but certainly free love and maybe polyamory and so on, it seems to me that that higher level resembles more what Engels had in mind about the remote past than the current age. So I suppose, would it be okay to say that in that higher level that they have in mind, that level resembles more the remote past than the current time?
Yes, I think that would be true. Yes, it's going to resemble more that. But again, they thought there's going to be more pairing taking place, but more loose relationships. Certainly, yeah, I think you're right. Closer to the primitive state than what they had in Europe in the 19th century.
Did they ever talk about incest? Did they go so far as to say that, this sexual liberation and so on would actually entail that if you feel free to have sex with your sister or your mother, whoever, that would be okay? And that, the prohibition of marrying your own mother is a bourgeois institution? Because in the origin of the family, the state and property, he does say that in the remote past, this promiscuous horde was indeed incestuous, that they did not know any restriction when it came to family and so on. Do they have anything to say about that in the future, about communism to come?
Yeah, you're right. They did talk about that in the past. I don't remember them ever mentioning that in their future society, though. So I don't remember them making any comments about that in particular.
Right, but I suppose that one way of abolishing the family would be doing away with these restrictions, right? I mean, if your ultimate goal is to abolish the family, then I suppose incestual relationships or restrictions against the incestual relationships would also have to go.
I suppose it would depend on what you saw as the if you saw there being biological problems with incest, which many people think that that's probably one of the reasons why incest has been prohibited, is because it creates possibilities of inherited genetic diseases and other kinds of things like that. I personally think that's not the only reason for incestuous prohibitions. I think it also has to do with emotional issues of family ties and relationships. But nonetheless, even if you negate that, the emotional ties within the family, you still could have biological problems of genetic disease.
Right. I'd like to close off this conversation asking you about contemporary events that relate to these topics. In your country, there's been a lot of social agitation because of racial tensions and so on. And the Black Lives Matter movement, it seems that it's much more than about just protecting Black lives, because some of their main leaders have said that they do want to, they don't say abolish the family, but they say that they reject the Western imposed, those are their words, the Western imposed nuclear family. How much do you think they're taking cue from Marx? And I mean, what do they mean by that, by rejecting the nuclear family? What do Black Lives Matter want as a replacement? Do they want the same thing as Marx, such as communal raisal of children and so on?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say that I'm fully supportive of the anti-racism side of Black Lives Matter. But you're right that they go way beyond, in the organized movement, they go way beyond that. And in fact, they are very heavily influenced by Marx in many ways, not just in relation to the family, but that I think is one element, that they're wanting to get rid of the nuclear family as it exists. Interestingly, though, if we're really interested in helping the African-American community in the United States, one of the best ways we can help them is by trying to encourage them to have stable families. In fact, interestingly, there are two key factors in people's lives that determine what their lifetime income is going to be. One of those probably everyone realizes, it's education. How much education you get will determine, on the average, of course, here, on the average, what your lifetime income will be. The other second factor might surprise some people, other people may not surprise though, is that if you get married and stay married to the same person throughout your life, that will increase your lifetime income. That and education are the two key factors. So if one of the biggest problems that our African-American community has in the United States, and I can't speak for other countries, but is that there's a very high divorce rate. There's a very high rate of having children out of wedlock, much higher than the than the Hispanic population or than the white population in the United States or East Asians. That is contributed immensely to their impoverishment, to other social problems and such. And so ironically, Black Lives Matter is talking about getting rid of the family, but really re-implementing the family in the African-American community would be one of the best things that could happen for the African-Americans, that would benefit them and help lift them out of poverty and give them a better life.
Right. I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, that some movements that seemingly liberate women by, having unrestricted sexuality and so on, easy divorce and so on, ultimately come back to hurt women. And I think some historians of the Soviet Union have frequently made this point. I mean, when the Bolsheviks arrived, yeah, there were easy divorce laws and so on, but that suited perfectly those men who were eager to have sex and not take any commitment, and ultimately it hurts the single mothers and so on. So I suppose it's the same with black women in the US. I mean, yeah, on the surface it seems very liberal, right? But at the end it's ultimately women who are harmed because they are the ones who have to be single mothers, and of course the children of single mothers. So I mean, that's, I suppose many of these idealistic movements have not thought enough about the consequences of what they propose, right?
Well, or they just, they either ignore or they just outright uh, just deny. In fact, I find it very disconcerting that in many cases, a lot of the people who are pushing for these kinds of ideas, they just ignore all of the social problems that have been created. So, for example, the sexual revolution in the 1960s and 70s in the US and Western Europe and such has led to immense social problems, increases in all sorts of psychological problems among children because they don't have stable families, increases in suicide rates among teens. There's all sorts of problems that I think is pretty likely caused by the breakdown of the family. But what's happening in our society today is that instead of saying, oops, we made a mistake, the people on the progressive side who are pushing these kinds of ideas are actually doubling down and even trying to push things even further away from, and even trying to break up the whole notion of family structure even in a greater way. And so I find this very unfortunate. And I think part of it is their desire to simply dismantle the status quo because of their hatred of authority structures. The family is an authority structure, at least as it's more traditionally in the sort of traditional family. And so they just double down and they try to destroy it even further rather than trying to bring about loving family structures and teaching people to operate within the context of servanthood, laying down their lives for others, loving others in the context. Instead, it's just about dismantling and tearing down these institutions that they see as oppressive.
Right. And I would also say that just like Marx and Engels, they have not made it clear what is the alternative. I mean, because it's very easy to say, oh, we reject the quote unquote white family. Okay, but what's the alternative? I mean, is it the communal raising of children? Is it group marriage? Is it polyamory? At least Black Lives Matter, they've never made it clear. So I suppose that these are catchy slogans in saying, oh, down with the family. Yeah, but what comes after that? They don't spell it out. And neither did Marx and Engels, as you have been claiming, right?
Yeah, I think one thing that happened too is that in some of these cases, and again, I can't know particular cases here, but I think there's a lot of cases where people themselves have grown up in less than ideal families, and that sort of colors their view of getting rid of families because they haven't had a loving father and a loving mother and loving siblings working together as a family unit in the way that is possible. They don't see that as being a possibility, but it is. It happens.
Marx and Engels appear to be that because, I mean, history has defeated them. Wherever their ideas have been implemented, they have not worked. And of course, there's a huge economic and political case to be made against their ideas. Now, in regards to the family, do you think that their ideas about the abolition of the family have any future? Will they resurface in the coming years?
Well, even though, as you're suggesting, they've not proven effective and have basically backfired in every society that they've been tried in the 20th century. Nonetheless, in the United States and in Western Europe, there still are a lot of intellectuals and scholars who are still pushing for Marxism, who still believe it and simply think that it hasn't been done in the, quote, the right way, and are still optimistic that they can somehow implement it in a way that others haven't. And so I do see these things continuing on, and even though Marxism-Leninism politically has been defeated in countries where it's been tried, in the United States, there's still a lot of Marxists around.
But you know, when it comes to the family, it seems to me that all these intellectuals are either unaware or embarrassed, because you hear a Marxist intellectual and they will talk about, you know, the collectivization of factories, you know, laborers taking over production and so on, but they will rarely speak about communal raising of children or the abolition of marriage and so on. Do you think they're embarrassed by how far Marx and Engels went with these ideas?
I don't know, and I'm not sure you're right though, because I think there are a lot of people people who are teaching feminist theory. There are a lot of people who are, at least among academics that I know about, there are a lot of people who are pushing some of these ideas. They may not be some of the leading political figures, but there's a lot of academics who indeed are trying to dismantle the family structure very forthrightly. And they're doing it in all sorts of, in gender studies departments, in ethnic studies departments and such. You know, they're doing it in maybe not as political leaders, but it's being promoted in a big way in academic circles.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, but what I meant is that whenever you hear any proposal of things like a commune or the communal raising of children and so on, at least in my mind, that seems to belong more to the 19th century. I don't hear so often, even though there may be critics of the family and gender studies department and so on, you don't hear, at least in my perception, many scholars spelling out and outright saying, okay, from now on, women need to give their children to the community and they will be raised communally. And a man, if he wants to bring another woman, he should do it, and so on. From that perspective, is that I mean that these ideas are not so frequent, because what I see in gender departments and so on, it's more the idea that, well, yeah, women have been oppressed and so on, but I don't hear them going so far as to say women should give the children to the commune.
No, I haven't heard that actually a lot either. You're right in that respect. Although very often they're trying to press for women having fewer children, and there's a very anti-child mentality that goes behind some of the ideas about liberation.
Right. Well, Professor Richard Weikart, this has been a very enlightening conversation, and I wish you all the best. And I think our listeners have learned a lot from your comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for the conversation. It was great.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.